My name's Wes Houser. For a long time, I have been concerned about trying to get some of the history of Brevard County, where it would be a permanent record with BCC or in a library, or if somebody would like to write a book on the early times in Brevard County. And two of my good friends, Dave Nisbet on my left and Joe Wickham on my right, have been here a good number of years. Dave Nisbet was born on Merritt Island, and Joe Wickham moved to Brevard County in the early 20s. But these two gentlemen, I'm sure, as well as other people in this community who have been here a long time, know happenings, things that have happened in the past in Brevard County that are not written anywhere. And one of these days, this information is going to be lost. Max King had agreed that if we could get the two of these good citizens of Brevard County together and just sit and discuss over a series of meetings some early happenings in Brevard County. I'm going to ask Dave Nisbet first to tell about being born on Merritt Island, our school systems, what hospitals we had, and some of the problems we had on Merritt Island, like mosquitoes. And next will be Joe Wickham, who I don't think there's anybody in the south part of the county, and probably in Brevard County itself, who has been more involved in the development of this community and contributing toward our standard of life. And these two gentlemen love Brevard County very much. So at this time, Dave, just tell some of the early happenings in Brevard County, and then we'll get with Joe and maybe discuss some old high school football games or that sort of thing back in the 20s.
Okay, Wes. Well, you said tell about when I was born. I don't really remember much about that, but I've been told that Dr. Hewlett came over by launch motorboat to deliver me, and because there weren't any bridges or anything like that back when I was born. It went back to kind of an unusual little community that I was born in called Indianola, about 4 miles north of 520 on Merritt Island on the Indian River side. And it was a little community that almost had, you might say, city services, because everybody went together, and we had a combined ownership of a carbide plant, which gave us carbide lights in our homes. We had running water produced by a big, the power that pumped it was run by a big water wheel that an artesian well turned. And that went to 15 at least houses. And then we also had a community clubhouse and a community school and a community church right within, quarter of a mile of where I was born. The interesting thing was that we did, have almost like city services, and we had a telephone in our home back in those days. My father and 4 other guys that lived in the area owned what was then the Brevard County Telephone Company, and it ran from New Smyrna to Jensen Beach. I don't imagine they had over 100 telephone poles to go that whole distance, because most of the wires were nailed on trees, and they didn't go right down the edge of the road. Of course, there weren't very many straight roads either, but they went down and zigzagged around from tree to tree. But we did have telephone. You crank the phone a little bit, and Central would answer and ask you who you wanted, and you didn't need to, in those days, know the number. Just tell her who you wanted, and she'd call them. But
what year were you born?
1912.
And when did your father move to this area?
Dad moved to Merritt Island from Glasgow, Scotland in 1885. And before he came over, the Mitchell brothers, some of their heirs are still in the neighborhood. Louis Brady is a very, very famous bone surgeon in Orlando. He's a grandson of one of the Mitchell brothers. And Mitch Ellington is a grandson of the Mitchell brothers.
Was your mother from Scotland also?
No, my mother grew up in London, but she was really born in New York City. Her parents came over to New York City and lived about a year or so, and then went back to London, and my mother grew up there till she was about 16, and then they decided to come back to the United States, and they came across the same year that my father came to Florida. But anyway, the Mitchell brothers had written my dad. They'd come over first to the United States and worked their way somehow or other down to Florida and over to Merritt Island. And they wrote Dad and told him what great country it was and the future they thought it would have, and they thought he ought to come over. So my dad and a Mr. Sam Grant, who was a first cousin of his, decided they'd come over. Dad was 18 and Mr. Grant was 19. And they came over directly from Glasgow, destination Merritt Island, and neither one of them, I don't think, ever left. Even went to go back to Scotland. I don't believe they did. I got lucky and went back and saw where Dad was born, but I don't think my father ever went back. But that little community was really quite an area. They also had a community packing house out on the end of a long dock, and they had what we basically call the Exchange Packing Company now, Florida Exchange, but in those days it was just the Indianola Exchange. But they all went together, built the packing house. They all went together and shipped their fruit.
That was on the west side of Merritt Island?
No, yes, on the west side, on the Indian River.
And where from where the 520 is now? North or
about
south?
4 miles north of 520. Then the freight boats would pick up the fruit right at the packing house and take it to Jacksonville. And in Jacksonville, it would be loaded onto a steamer going to New York.
And I explain, say, going to elementary school and through high school, on what kind of facilities were here. I'm sure BCC wasn't here then. And,
no, they hadn't quite gotten here. I started in school, Wes, in a one-room building that had all 12 grades in it, if there happened to be all 12 grades. You know, some years maybe we would only have 10 or 11 kids, and there wasn't always every grade covered. But I think there were about 3 of us in the first grade when I started school there. And during about midway of my second grade year, the school in Cocoa was taking all the children from this whole surrounding area into a combined school system, and they closed the one on Merritt Island. So we rode buses, and I wish you could see the bus that I used to ride on. It was a Model T Ford with an elongated frame, and it was real narrow, long job with just a really little pickup chassis is all it was, but extended to carry the bus body. And we kids used to get in the back of the bus and jump up and down, and that would raise the wheels off the front wheels off the ground, and the driver would have a little difficulty in steering, and he'd scream at us, and we'd sit down for a little while, and then we'd do it again. We had a lot of fun on the bus. I can remember that.
Was there one teacher for all of you?
One teacher for the whole deal, and that teacher in my school happened to be Mrs. Sweet Smith's sister, and she just died here a couple of years ago. I tried to keep track of her. She moved back up into Georgia and lived all of her life, and I didn't ever see her again, I don't think ever, but she was always a very favorite person in my mind.
All right, now say through the 12th grade, what organized athletic events did you have, if any?
Well, Cocoa was a baseball town back in those days, a very big baseball town, and consequently the high school team had a good baseball team. When I was in junior high, the Cocoa high school baseball team played in the state tournaments on 2 or 3 occasions. Didn't ever win the state championship back in those days, but they were always a contender. They beat people like Orlando and quite a lot bigger cities. And football was just really in its beginning. My senior year in high school, they didn't have a football team because there weren't enough boys to play. My junior year, they did have a team, and I got to play in a little bit. I didn't have all of this back in those days. I weighed about 125 pounds in high school, and I wasn't fast either. So I wasn't a whole lot of help to the football team. But
you play baseball?
I played baseball and all the way through my time. But football, I had an interesting experience, I think. Doesn't have much to do with just old times, but it was something for me to think back on. I put on my first football uniform behind a car as another guy took it off up in Titusville. One of the boys got hurt, and we only had 11, and I'd never been out for practice and never had on a uniform. So they grabbed me and said, "You're eligible, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm passed." And they said, "Well, come here, we need you." And they had me putting on a uniform and in on the field. The first play of the game, Nelson Smith was our field goal kicker, and back in those days you drop kicked. And it was 4th and 40 or something like that yards, and we needed to kick real bad. The fellow that had gotten hurt was our punter. So I couldn't kick, and they knew that, but they thought maybe Nelson Smith, because he was a good drop kicker, might be able to punt. So they called him back into the backfield and rearranged things, and he drop kicked the ball. And in spite of, as I say, I wasn't very fast, but I was the first one down to the ball, and I dove on it. I thought that was what you're supposed to do. Back in those days, a drop kick, he had drop kicked it. And back in those days, a drop kick ball was free. I could have picked it up and run with it, but I didn't know that. The coach told me afterwards, he wished I'd have known. I said, I do too. But anyway, we had an interesting school situation back in those days. There were 9 in my senior class, and the whole high school wasn't as big as the senior class at Merritt Island or Cocoa. Either one will be this year, for the whole high school.
Okay, well, let's get with Joe a minute, and we thought on the first session would be, dealing with you two gentlemen's early lives and what it was like in Brevard County, and we're going to get back to Dave in a minute. But Joe, tell us, what your parents did and where you came from, and the same sort of thing Dave's been telling us about going to school in Brevard County in the early days.
Well, before I do anything else, I often wondered why Dr. Hewlett became a missionary and a doctor in Africa, and it was after tending to David in those early days.
No, that was it was his uncle that delivered me.
Yeah.
The Dr. Hewlett that you knew was a young fellow.
Well, my father, of course, he was from the Middle West, and his father had migrated out into the central part of the United States to Iowa in 1843, and he drove an ox team out there. And that's the way he became involved in being out in Iowa. And each year, he came from a large family, and they were the original homesteaders in that section of the state. And during his time in college, which was about 1905, he began to invest in land, and he had purchased, even in those days, here in Florida, 40 acres of land at about $5 down and $5 when they could catch you, And this was quite a good investment for him, and he had 3 large farms out in Iowa, and right after World War I, the banks began to fail and everything else, and he lost all of those. And that is the way he came to Florida to look about this 40 acres that he had invested in and purchased way back while he was still in college. My mother came also from the central part of Iowa, and her name was Rich, and we lost her just 2 or 3 years ago at 96. And they had come down here to see what his piece of land was like. It was a section out west of Melbourne and west of Malabar, and was called Melbourne Farms in those days. And this was the center of what was now known as the Melbourne-Tillman Drainage District, that everyone has had so many controversial things to talk about in the past few years. And he, being an engineer, became acquainted with a fellow by the name of Jim Hunter, who also was an engineer. And he went to work with them to lay out the Melbourne-Tillman Drainage District, and he stayed here the rest of his entire life. And little did they realize that way back in those early days when they were laying that out, that now they would be the city of Palm Bay and all of these other areas, which and part of the city of Melbourne, which have become a part of this big controversial Melbourne-Tillman Drainage District. And I think that it just shows you that what people start to do in the beginning when they were trying to drain the land and make it ready for agriculture and that sort of thing, suddenly, over a period of many years, that is not the objective of that land anymore. It's now a residential area and commercial businesses and that sort of thing, and the very thing for which they drained it in the beginning is gone. And this shows you what progress and different environment and different things that happen in the community, what happens to you under those conditions. Mm-hmm. So all of this area, even though the district is still intact and they have their own leadership and so forth, is the whole concept for that Melbourne-Tillman Drainage District as the Crane Creek Drainage District, which just to the north of it, have completely changed, because now it's all basically residential. Mm-hmm. And that is the way we came here in the beginning. And when I look back and think of our little community, and when they had a little old, not a little, but an old green wooden schoolhouse here in O'Galley that was on the piece of property right where the Methodist Church is, St. Paul's Methodist Church is now. And they moved it across the street way about 1824 or 5 and built the schools that you now know down on Pineapple, where they complex is there for the senior training program today. And it's interesting to note that in this adult educational program, they've got about 5 or 6 times as many students as they had in those early days, and is doing a tremendous job. And it just makes you realize how important and the things that are happening to the community are.
Well, Joe, were you born in this area?
I was born in Ames, Iowa. Came here when I was a boy.
Now, how about your early school days? Was it a one-room type?
No, the one-room schoolhouse that they had in this area in the beginning was out at Bovine, which is out near where Turtle Mound is. From right here where we're sitting, it was about 2 miles further west. And that was the original. Bovine was the section that when you came down the St. Johns River by boat and you landed at Turtle Mound, which you've all heard about. This was on the path of the little road that came back into town here, into the old O'Galley, and this is where Lansing Gleason, as an example, and the Nails, and that group of people went to school in a little one-room schoolhouse out there. And in the early days, the school system in Brevard County was not as it is today, and David realizes this too, and he can remember this, that every community floated a bond issue to pay for their school system, their schools and all. And instead of having a countywide system as we have today, we had school districts, and the people in that area paid for the ad valorem tax, paid for the schools in that area.
Would like O'Galley have their own system, and
Cocoa had their own. They had their own system to the extent that they paid all the bond issues, and even helped be responsible for the employment of the school teachers.
So there was no county organization.
And that started, the county organization started in the early 30s, if I remember correctly, by Mrs. Shelburne. Do you remember Mrs. Shelburne?
I sure do. She was superintendent of schools when I was in high school.
This is the lady that helped get it organized into a countywide program as we have.
But I think they always had the school board for the whole county.
But they had trustees in every school area that took care of the school operation in there. Quite interesting thing, but now today it's entirely different. And it's better this way too, because schools are really, the entire county is taken care of under this system now.
But the system you're talking about, people in Titusville would not be taxed for expenditures for Melbourne.
That is correct. In other words, if we wanted to build a new school within our area, you paid for it by the people in your area.
Right, now, when you were, say, in the 4th or 5th grade, how many students were in school, and how many different classrooms did you have?
Well, they all had, basically after they built the new school, which was in 1924 in Old Galley, which is on Pineapple Avenue now, as you see it up there, they had usually not over 2 grades in one classroom, but basically they had a classroom for each group. And as you worked up, and the interesting part about it, you didn't have 1,000 people in that program or something else. If you had 100, 150 in the entire school system, you were doing well.
I would say back in 1925, what was the most populous area in the county? Was it the southern part or Cocoa?
No, I believe at that time I would say it was in the Cocoa area, but we began to grow in this area during the boom of the 25s. Mm-hmm. And that's when we began to grow, and this, as an example, this is when they began to open up the beach over at Melbourne Beach. Before that, you had to get on a boat over at Melbourne and ride over to Melbourne Beach on a little steamer that let you off at the pier down there, and then there was a little track, and you could get on that and ride up, and either with horse or mule, they'd tow you up to the beach. And this was before there was any in the Atlantic over there at all. And finally, they decided to build in the early 20s, to build a nice wooden bridge across the Atlantic. The first thing they did was burn down, and then they had to rebuild it again. And this is when Schwartzberg and Mr. Schwartzberg and Cownhoven and that bunch began to develop which is now known as India Atlantic.
And what was the time you were up, say, through the high school, what was the main economy for this area?
The main economy for our community in those early days was fishing and citrus, and it all basically came off of Merritt Island. We had logging, though. We had tremendous sawmill down in Melbourne. It cut up to 150,000 board feet of lumber a day. And the turpentine steels in those early days, all of the wooded area was turpentines, and unlike it is today, and where they pulp it.
How'd they get the lumber to the mill?
They would cut it, and I could go into a long discourse over the one in Melbourne, but I think we ought to talk about that sometime, because it is really an interesting thing. But they would truck or by mules get here on the mainland, and cut the logs and take them to the mill. We had lots of small sawmills in this area also, but there were 2 big sawmills in this country, one here and one at Holy Paw. That one at Holy Paw was, even though this was a big one in Melbourne, cut about 250,000 board feet of lumber a day, and that's a tremendous amount of profit. But
what year were you born, Joe?
I hate to admit this, but I'm a year older than David. I was born in 1911.
You both went to school here about the same time.
That is correct.
Do you remember when the first time you all met each other?
I can't remember, but it seemed to me like I've known David from the time we were forever, and we were all real close together. And I had an opportunity in the early days, right after World War, or right after the Depression came on, and when the banks closed in 1929. I was working in the area and up in Cocoa, and I think that's when I really got to know David on a personal basis.
Back in your high school days, you didn't know each other?
Well, only during, from competition. No, golly, we had quite a track team back in those days, basically. We had a mile relay team, as an example, that won the state championship. And these are all local boys, and we were good in track, fairly good in baseball and basketball, and in those early days we were just beginning to develop football teams.
Joe, I think you left out a couple of things that helped the south end of the county get started in growing about that time you were talking about. Of course, you have to give the Platt family a little credit. They were raising a lot of cows and bringing them into Melbourne, weren't they?
Oh yes, the Platt family, and as I said, but the biggest product we had to develop was that sawmill. They employed hundreds and hundreds of people, and the community was very different than it is today. As an example, up in Cocoa, the railroad ran down through town. Down here in our old part of O'Galley, the road ran down what is now known as Guava, and you went underneath Highland Avenue where the Civic Center is, under a bridge, and the end of the Florida East Coast Railroad at the beginning, at one time, was the city dock that's out there that you see out in the Indian River. That was before they were able to build the bridges across Crane Creek in Melbourne and Elbow Creek there in O'Galley. And they would unload their freight cars down there and put them on barges or boats and take all of their freight on down the river from there until they were able to build the bridges across these two rivers. And this was quite interesting. And up until, just about World War II, that big gully came down through the city, and they did not even tear that wooden bridge out until way in the 30s, because the trains used to run down underneath there and unload, and then we had some tremendous fires down in there in those days. And
But the train would go underground?
It went under. The bridge was on where Highland Avenue is now. That's the reason they called it Highland Avenue. And the trains run underneath it, big steam trains, and they would park and then right opposite about where the post office is now, it would turn off a Guava and go out diagonally through there, through where First Union Bank is and the post office. That was the main feeder line of the railroad until it got over to where the bridges are. And I think one of the interesting things about it is when they moved it to where you see it today, the Florida East Coast Railroad. If I remember correctly, it was Grandpa Gleason who owned all that property out there. That's Lansing's father. And they wanted the right-of-way, and he made sure that if they give the right-of-way, that all passenger trains would stop in O'Galley, in which they agreed to do. And it was interesting to go out there. They had a little depot out there. It must have been about 12, 15 feet wide, about 20, 25 feet long. Couldn't see anything but palmettos everywhere around. And they would stop out there, and big Pullman trains either going from north or south, so Grandpa Gleason could get on and off if we wanted to go. And which I thought was a great thing. And this is the way it began to develop the area, because all of the crews began to use this as an exchange spot where they would go and come. But the area grew and prospered in spite of all of our problems. And our fishing is still quite a business within our area, but not like it was in those early days.
I think on this is our first meeting here today, and what I'd like to limit it to today would be next to have you all explain the interesting things that happened to you while you were still in high school. Things that you remember, and I think, Dave, you told me a couple of things when we gone to football games together about the old Brevard Hotel with the roof and the cattle drive from Merritt Island. But if you would, why don't you two guys tell about your first 12 years here in school, the things you did in the summertime, the living conditions. I understood they had some mosquitoes. And then on the next meeting we have, then we'll talk about maybe when you all went to school and college and the early business days, when you all started working for a living and raising families here and how that was. But what are some of the things that you all remember of interest when you were in high school?
Well,
I think you had horses and...
Yeah, you said I had told you about driving cattle. I think that's probably the most interesting experience in my whole life. At the time, at least, I thought it was, and I'll never forget it. But back before World War I, there were range cattle on Merritt Island. And after World War I, they opened up North Merritt Island, which is now NASA area, for homesteading, particularly for World War I veterans. And when those young men came and started their homesteads, and they clear by hand a small section and plant it in garden, the cattle would go in and eat the garden. So they got pretty upset about that. They shot a few of them and one thing and another, and then they got petitions up, and they finally brought it to an election, and Merritt Island was one of the first places in Florida to go with what is known as a no-fence law. which sounds a little backwards, but it means you don't have to fence your farm because somebody has to fence their animals. They can't run loose anymore. So when that passed on Merritt Island, the people that had the range cattle did not have land enough to take care of their animals, and they had to get rid of them. So they sold them to the Platt family here in west of Melbourne. They went to the Board of County Commissioners, who had just finished this nice wooden bridge, which happens to have been the first bridge across the intercoastal waterway between Daytona Beach and I believe Palm Beach. Fort Pierce may have been ahead of us, but no other town was. And I think it was Palm Beach to Daytona. Anyway, they were so proud of their brand new bridge that when the Platts went to them and asked for permission to drive the cattle across, they said, well, you'll have to put up a bond to protect it. And part of this is hearsay to me because I was an awful little kid, but I heard it so many years ago that I believe it to be true. Mr. Platt said, well, how much bond would you need? And they said, well, $25,000. And that sounds like such a pittance of money today when you're thinking of replacing a bridge or a causeway. And yet it would have been enough to have replaced a good share of that bridge, just $25,000. Built out of heart pine lumber, 4-inch thick planks by 12 inches. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. But they made arrangements to drive the cattle across there. And I had the good fortune of having a Shetland pony, and they allowed me to go behind the main herd and keep the calves kind of pushed up, and when you drive cattle for any distance, the calves lag behind, and you'll see 800 or 900 head of cattle and maybe 200 calves, and the calves will all be in the back. Well, they let me go along behind with a cow whip and my cowboy suit on, and oh boy, if ever was a kid in hog heaven, that was me. But it was a historical event for our area, and the last group that we drove through Cocoa was a very small herd of cattle. And cattle are peculiar. You can handle a big herd easier than you can a small herd. Small herds split off and break up. And they broke up right in downtown Cocoa because that first bridge came into Cocoa at Harrison Street. And Harrison Street led through, had a little zig to it, and turned into Magnolia and went back another block and crossed the railroad. Well, when we got the cattle across the railroad, they were then able to be turned loose, and we didn't have to go any further because just a small group of cattlemen that the Platts brought with them could take them from there, and they drove them on back. But this last group that we drove through there were just maybe 100 head, and they broke up, and they went wild in downtown Cocoa. One went in what used to be the Palms restaurant, the one Greek restaurant we had in town, and they had to get a rope on it and drag it out of there. And one big bull went in the Buick garage, which is where Pots and Pans is now, and walked in and went up to a big plate glass window and just looked at himself in it and turned around and walked out. Everybody knew he was going to charge that other bull. He probably thought he saw, but he didn't. And it was a very lively, about 2 hours there of getting those corral back together and getting them across the railroad track. But I think that was one of the most interesting old-time things that ever happened to me.
I think one of the most interesting things, we haven't even thought about it, is how Brevard County was formed in the beginning. And originally it was known as Mosquito County, and it ran from way up in where Volusia County is.
Ran from St. Augustine. And
then all the way down to St. Lucie. And it went all the way over to the high grounds west where Highway 27 is now. And then one of the first county seats was at Enterprise. You know where the Enterprise is?
Mm-hmm.
up there at the other side of Sanford, and then they moved us from there down to Basswood, which is now known as Kenansville, and then it was moved to O'Galley one time, and finally about 1884 or something like that, old man Titus, a gentleman from Titusville, who was quite a sport, I understand, give the land where the courthouse is today. At the same time, that was the very year that the Titusville Star-Advocate, Mr. Hudson, established the Titusville paper.
But Brevard County went as far north as Kenansville?
No, as far west as Kenansville over there, yes. Yeah. And what happened to it, the first thing they did, then they changed it from Mosquito County to St. Lucie for a little while. And then they split off the area which is to the west, where Osceola County and Orange County is and that sort of thing. Then they split off the lower section, which they call St. Lucie. I think one of the most interesting things about it was that the first time they floated a bond issue or something, they had way in the 80s, they had a fire and burn up all the records they had by moving them back and forth, and they set a millage, and if I remember correctly, Mr. Houston was the chairman of the county commission in those days, and the 1 mill and for operation and 1 mill for the school system, you know, and they wanted to build a courthouse, and this thing was, if I remember correctly, about 16 by 12 by 16 or something like that, and it was going to be made of logs. And it was going to cost $500. And the most interesting thing about it was that they couldn't, they didn't have enough money to pay him, so they paid the fellow $200 down and $300 after the taxes were collected. And then I thought this was quite an interesting and very small, minute way of how Brevard County began to grow. And this was way back in the 1880s. And think how far we've come since then. Isn't that fascinating?
I can remember well, Joe, and you can too, when the FEC Railroad used to be good Samaritans and pay their taxes early.
That is correct.
So schools could open. There wouldn't be, nobody would have, schools would be out of money, the county commissioners would be out of money, and they couldn't collect any money until after the 1st of October. I mean, the new year didn't start. But FEC Railroad was a good Samaritan, and they would pay their taxes early so school could open.
Back in those days, you couldn't borrow the money from the bank?
Heavens, no.
They had only one bank, and that was the old Barnett Bank. You remember that? That really accomplished
actually,
anything.
Joe, I'm talking about before the days of the Barnett Bank. I'm talking about going back when there was the Melbourne State Bank.
Well, that all went under in the 20s.
And the Cocoa Bank, yeah, but they failed during the 1928. Cocoa Bank and Trust Company and the Brevard Bank and Trust Company and Cocoa and one or two banks in Titusville that failed. But the only place you could get any money back in, and this is the time that I'm talking about FEC paying their taxes in advance, was when everybody was broke. The only place in central Brevard County that you could get a money order cash other than at the post office was at Travis Hardware. You could get a check cashed, you know, an out of state, if it was a U.S. government check or something that was good. You could go in, Mr. Travis had money enough to cash it, but nobody else in town did.
You know, the railroad in those days, they assessed you on mileage, and they had a double track, so they just about knew where they were going to be all the way through the county. And that's the reason when they began to raise the taxes and assess them on the mileage basis and everything else, that they ripped out one whole set of tracks in there because they cut down their tax.
And they had 2 tracks?
Yeah,
It was a double track system, see? And when they began to get more sophisticated with their controls and everything else, rather than pay that big high price for all of the mileage of track, they just ripped half of it out. And that's, even though they've got the same old right-of-way, they still now only have one set of tracks in the whole county. Quite interesting, but that's exactly it. But it was a beautiful double track, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And that was put in, that's really what helped break the FEC Railroad, though. Flagler was carried away with 2 things. He wanted to put a railroad all the way to Key West, and that really never paid. And he also wanted to double track it, and that never really paid. And so the FEC got through that and the hard times of the Depression.
Well, he had the desire to have all these big hotels all up and down the thing, you know. And,
Well, I think they made money.
but I'm just saying where a lot of his money went that he was trying to
Oh,
put
yeah.
into that. Because under land grant railroads, you know, he got the land given to him by the state and all. Then he got these other various land grants of property. And he was going to, and he did a great job, and it's the reason it was opened up. And over on the West Coast, there was this plant. You remember that over there where they
Did the same thing.
did the same thing. They'd give you just miles and miles of right-of-way and acres of land, but that was an incentive for the people with money to come and open up the area in which we live. And that's exactly how the East Coast got developed, because of people like Henry Flagler who invested his money, and they gave him all of these nice pieces of land, and he was going to put hotels in them. He opened it up for land development. An example, in the early days when we had pineapple orchards, grows between where the Atlantic is now and back up this way, and until the blight got them. This was the way they began to develop and ship by rail, you know.
Actually, Flagler is basically what killed the pineapple business in Florida. It used to be a big pineapple area between Vero Beach and Fort Pierce, all in that section with solid pineapples when I was a little boy. And when Flagler put his railroad to Key West, in order to try to make that pay, he started hauling Cuban pineapples from Key West to Jacksonville, cheaper than he would haul Florida pineapples from Fort Pierce to Jacksonville. It was just please come on and give me some business, you know, so he gave him a cheap price. But what it did, it knocked the price off of the Florida pineapples to the point that they couldn't really make money, so they all went out of business over a period of
But
short
you know,
time.
that railroad was a very fascinating thing. When you and I were young, when 29, the train came in from 29, which is a passenger train, everybody in town that wasn't working came out to see the train come through town. And if someone was out there selling peanuts, you know, and sandwiches and everything else,
Oranges.
and the tourist who come down, he was fascinated when they looked out the windows and they had these people going up and down the outside of the train hawking the things they had to sell. Same thing when 29 and 30 came up in the south. But I think one of the most interesting things about this whole thing is now when you mail a letter from Cocoa to Melbourne, or from Melbourne to Cocoa, it ends up going over to Orlando and gets lost and comes back. It takes 3 or 4 days to get here. Back in those early days, 18 minutes from the time it was put on at Melbourne, it'd be in Cocoa, and that shows you how much progress has been made over the last 50, 60 years.
The stamps weren't 22 cents each.
The Sanford, they were 3 cents. But I'm just saying, but that, in those early days, they had the old speed arm, you know, that they hung out there for the mail. And if they went through there with that thing doing 60 miles an hour, what would happen is that the man on the train who was in the mail department, he would sort all the mail between when he took it on between there and the next stop, and he would have it ready to go on. Even though the train didn't stop, he'd have it hooked so that they would take it. And this is the way they used to deliver that mail. It was quite a unique thing, and it was very progressive. And then nowadays they do it entirely different. It's all scientifically logged in. And
Well, I remember when the trains used to go by and they had this thing up there, and the thing went by with a hook to pick a bag up, and it never slowed down. It just
that's
hooked
exactly what they had here.
Uh-huh.
And I think when you look back, it was a very unique thing. But those fellows would work so fast that if something was loaded in Melbourne or O'Galley going north, or from Cocoa and Rockledge going south, and to be taken off either at Melbourne or O'Galley, they would have that bag ready and hooked on the side of that train if they weren't going to stop by going.
How many trains would you have in a day?
Well, we had 2 basically. One was 29 that came down from the north in the morning, and 30 come back in the afternoon. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. But everybody in the community wasn't working, always came down to the depot to see them come and go. It was quite an outing, you know.
Well, I was born and raised in West Palm Beach, and I remember when I was 7 or 8 years old, which would be about the middle of 35, my uncle had a hotel up in New England, and my daddy would take us up there in the summertime for a vacation. And the thing that stood out in my mind most is that when we got to Fort Pierce, he would stop and gas the car up, and we'd all get a Coca-Cola or eat breakfast and go to the bathroom and all that. And he would not stop again until he got to St. Augustine, because he did not want to stop in Brevard County because the way the water tasted and the way the mosquitoes were. And that set on my mind when I was a very young person that Brevard County had to be the worst place in the state of Florida.
Well, we had one thing.
My dad left. But after I moved here in '56, and I wish that I had been born and raised in Brevard County. I think it's one of the most interesting places. But I'd like, and we're going to get into maybe our next session, mosquito control, what you fellas did when you were back on the county commission a long time ago. But you had mentioned something about fishing, and if you'd like y'all to explain were our waters polluted then, and could you swim in the Indian River, and were there trout in the river, and what caused the trout to leave, and why don't you all discuss some of those early times?
Well, I've got a particular philosophy about what helped get rid of a lot of the trout. We still have a lot of trout, but we don't have as many as we used to. Difference is we have a lot more fishermen, for one thing, but another thing is I always believe in supply and demand sort of handles a lot of things, and the food cycle is one of the biggest things. Back years and years ago, we had mosquitoes, and we really had mosquitoes bad. We had every mosquito came out of larvae and so forth out of water on the salt marshes mostly. But anyway, those mosquito larvae were food for the little gambuso minnows, which were a little minnow about 1 inch long. They're a little higher class minnow now called guppy, and people have in their living room in little glass containers. But the guppy is just nothing but a higher class gambuso, and a gambuso minnow lived on mosquito larvae. And Joe can verify this. We ran some tests back in our early days of fighting them, and found out that one little minnow can eat 100 mosquito larvae an hour. That's 2,400 mosquito larvae a day, one little fish. So that was one of our means of helping get rid of mosquitoes. But when we did that, we cut down on the amount of larvae there was. And we cut down on the food for the little gambuso minnows. And when we cut down on them, there weren't in a little bit of time, there weren't nearly as many little minnows. And the little minnows is what the trout lived on. So when we didn't have any larvae for the little minnows to eat, we didn't have any little minnows for the trout to eat, the trout starved off too. And I think that getting rid of mosquitoes had an awful lot to do with the less trout in the river today. But I don't think anybody wants to trade back.
Well, not only that, I think that one of the things we've got to face is the fact that we have beginning to have, for many, many years now, begun to lose all of our grass beds in the river, for the simple reason that we've had so much fast runoff from all of this development and everything else, that covering all of these grass beds out in the Indian River now is silt and that sort of thing. If you fly over in an airplane, you can see it coming out into the river, and it's covering up and killing these grass beds, which were the breeding areas and for all of these trout and everything else. And we've got to begin to reclaim that so that we can in the future get them back where they are, where they used to be. I'm talking about places for them to breed and to feed and that sort of thing. And unless we do this and begin to reclaim the bottom, we're going to slowly but surely lose more and more. I agree that one of the things that they fed on was what David was talking about, is mosquito larvae. By the same token, they now do not have the kind of places to hatch and to have their beds and everything else that they used to have. And if we control the input for the water that's coming off of out of all these tributaries, so that we don't get all that silt and everything out in there, and begin to reclaim those grass beds, we'll have trout as we used to have them. And I think, there's still places where you take the old-time fisherman who he knows where to go look for them, but we still got a golden opportunity to salvage this whole Indian River program.
Well,
and make it work.
I agree with you, Joe. I think the runoff from subdivisions is our biggest pollutant. I don't think some of the things that get talked about the very most amount to nearly as much as the runoff from the various subdivisions.
That's what I'm saying, and we've got to control that runoff, and so that we don't have all that encroachment.
Back in those days, could you swim in the river?
I didn't know there was any other there, and in the ocean was the only place you did go swimming.
Well, did you ever have mullet in your home?
Well, we used to take mullet, and we used to catch all the mullet we needed, yes. We used to, when we were young fellows in the 20s, for instance, we'd go out on the drawbridge, which was out in the middle of the river, and one person would take care of the clothes, and we'd all dive overboard and swim all the way to shore. We did that every night to cool off, you know. And I think these are interesting things.
Well, was the river, could you see the bottom then?
In those days, and they talk about phosphorus and everything else, and there's too much phosphorus. Dave, you remember back in the 20s, it just looked like a great sparkler. The whole river was just a massive spark, and you could see every fish that swam, every crab, could you not, without even the light.
That's the biggest change in the river to me, is what became of the phosphorus.
Right.
You used to be able to go out at night and walk down a dock with a spear, and you could see the fish, and you could, after you fished a little bit, you could tell what kind they were by their movement, by the length of the phosphorus and so forth. And you also learned about how far ahead of that light they were. And I've speared a lot of fish at night and not having anything to throw at except seeing that light in the water. I don't know what became of
But it would light the entire river. It was just like a great sparkler, wasn't it?
Right. But you know, one of the things that I think is interesting is when we talk so much about the pollutants in the river, when I was a kid, there wasn't a clam in the Indian River in my area. There may have been some down around Sebastian. I'm not sure on that. I know there were some down around Fort Pierce. But the area between Cocoa and Merritt Island, up in there wasn't a single clam. Now it's an industry. I don't know, maybe the clams like pollutants, but we didn't used to have them, and now we have lots of them. So the river isn't dead, as you hear sometimes reference of. It needs some correcting, but I don't think we've got a dead river.
I think one of the greatest things about the whole river now is that people are being alerted to the fact, and they're now beginning to get involved in trying to figure out the way to salvage this river for the future. And I think this is wonderful, because that's what's going to happen. And we've got people interested from all the way from Daytona south to Palm Beach, interested in the Indian River Lagoon program. Isn't that interesting?
Well, I think one of the nicest things we have in Brevard County is what Mother Nature put here. I think we have more natural beauty here than any other county in the state of Florida. And we're about out of time today, but we're going to, at our next meeting, maybe get into some early history of you guys in government, and let it go from there on wherever you all so direct. So we thank you.
Very good, Wes. Thank you.
It's been very pleasant this afternoon.
All right. This is Wes Houser again. With me is Dave Nisbet and Joe Wickham, and we're trying to get from these two guys some of the early history and the important developments that happened in Brevard County. Our first meeting that we had last week, we discussed their childhood and what happened in the county then up through like high school. And today, Joe and Dave are going to talk about some important events that occurred in Brevard County back in the 20s and the establishment of our government. And I don't think there's anybody more familiar with our local government than Joe Wickham, who is a past county commissioner, and also Dave Nisbet, who is a past county commissioner. Dave also served on the Port Authority. Joe, how long were you a county commissioner?
Six terms.
So that's 24 years.
24 years, yes.
Dave, you were county commissioner how long?
Just 2 terms.
All right, so you were 8 years. Did you have any other elected officers, Joe, while you were doing all that?
Oh, I was on the city council of the city of O'Galley before I became a county commissioner.
How long were you on that?
4 or 5 years, something like that.
So you've got like 30 years as a office holder, an elected office holder in Brevard County.
That is correct.
And Dave, I know you were on the Port Authority.
I was on the Port Authority altogether about 12 or, no, I think 12 years.
Okay, and county commissioner for 8 years.
Right,
So you've got like 20 years.
right.
So between the two of these gentlemen, we have like 50 years of service to Brevard County as an elected official. Joe, why don't you lead off today and explain some of the notes you have there?
I think this would be most interesting to the general public because this is a past history of Brevard County and how it was formed in the first place. I have here as in my notes that on November the 23rd, 1828, there was 7 counties formed in the entire state of Florida. And this one was, the boundaries were Lake Monroe on the north to Lake Okeechobee and Hillsborough Inlet on the south, and to the high sand hills on the west, which is now Orange, Lake, Polk, Osceola, Okeechobee counties, and to the Atlantic Ocean on the east. Now this is our Brevard County in the early days. The first county seat was Enterprise on Lake Monroe, north of Sanford, in 1844. Then they changed the name to St. Lucie County. Then in 1854, the name was changed to Brevard in honor of Theodore Washington Brevard, with the county seat at St. Lucie. Later, they moved the county seat to Basswood, which is now Kenansville, and then to O'Galley, and then to Lake View on Lake Marion. You know where Lake Marion is, way out down by Kenansville. Then in 1871, all the records were destroyed by fire. Then John Houston of O'Galley, who was the chairman of the county commission at that time, established the first tax district with 5 mills for county operation and 1 mill for the schools. At the same meeting, they authorized a new courthouse. Its size was 12 feet by 16 feet and made of logs. And then in 1877, Osceola County was formed from Brevard County. And then in 1879, Henry Titus gave the land in Titusville for the courthouse. Then in 1880, a new jail was built with a cost of $565, with a $200 down payment and the rest when taxes were collected. Also, the local newspaper, the Titusville Star Advocate, was formed at the same year with Mr. Hudson as its owner and editor. Then we have in 1905, St. Lucie County was formed from Brevard with the north boundary at the Sebastian Inlet. And from this humble beginning we have grown and flourished. And in the early days, about that same time is when the Union Cypress Lumber Company began to be an important part of the economy here in South Brevard. I just thought those were interesting pieces of information as far as the historical value of the area.
Was most of the lumber there used in Brevard County, or was it distributed throughout the state?
Oh, the lumber was distributed throughout the state, and they had a tremendous sawmill which was down in the Hopkins area, which is just on the south side of the creek, of Crane Creek in the city of Melbourne, and they had their own railroad going out to the Deer Park area, where Hopkins, as this map shows, had 110,000 acres of land that was owned by the Hopkins Land Company and Union Cypress Sawmill. In those days, that was a great cypress area, and they had trees up to 5 and 6 feet in diameter out there. When one tree would fill an entire flat car, instead of having loads of logs like you see today. And I think one of the interesting things was that the names of the little community that they served headed west. First of all, from Hopkins, you'd go to a little place called Gagner, Gagner. Then you come to Patterson. Then as you hit the swamp area, you had Alpha, which was the beginning. Then you had Omega, which was the end of the marsh areas. And then you got to Deer Park. And this was in the days when this was one of the thriving sawmills in the entire state of Florida. And they operated all the way up through the 20s and into the 30s before they had a tremendous fire there and wiped out the sawmill as we know it here in South Brevard. I just thought those were interesting pieces of information. And the area in which they controlled, those of you who go out 192 at the present time realize that they owned about 8 or 10 miles straight north of there and about 5 or 6 miles south of the 192 as you see it today. Isn't that interesting? They owned all of that land in the early days.
It'd be nice to have all that today, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't it be nice to have all of that today? But this is what has happened to us in the past. And when you ride out there, this sawmill was out there long before there were any paved roads or any roads at all to get across the river. And you had to get on a flat car here with your car to ride over to Deer Park because there were no bridges across the St. John's. And from there on, you could get onto an 8-foot wide brick road and drive from there all the way to St. Cloud. Of course, you went through Weewahootie, Holy Paw, Illihaw, Nidtaw, all those lovely Indian.
They were all dirt roads?
They were all dirt roads except this one road headed to St. Cloud, which was 8 feet wide and made of bricks. And if you happened to drive along there and had a flat tire, no one ever had a jack like they have today. They'd get a fence post or something, take the bricks out of the middle of the road and use them for a fulcrum and a brace. They'd pry their car up in the air, and then after they changed the tire, they'd forget to put the bricks back in the holes, and they'd just drive away and leave them. It was quite an interesting trip when you rode across there.
But the highway was brick?
The highway was brick.
I remember some of the old streets in St. Augustine were brick.
Well, these brick out here were not laid in mortar or anything else. They were just laid on the sand, and so they were very easy to dig out and to use as part of your jack system. Quite interesting.
The road from Daytona Beach to Jacksonville was a 9-foot wide brick road for years, and that's what turned into US 1.
Well, the original US 1 used to be the River Road, didn't it?
Going through Cocoa, yes. I'm talking about
Rockledge and Cocoa, yes.
It was shell through Brevard County, as I first remember it. And you got quite a few of those flat tires Joe was talking about because you'd run over a conch shell. Those tires back in those days didn't stand quite the abuse that our tires today do. They weren't steel banded,
It took you about all day to get from Grant up to Titusville, when you drove it.
That was quite a trip.
And,
but, there's one thing I think always stands out in my mind about talking about those flat tires that I wish we were more like we used to be. You used to stop on the side of the road and get out, get your jack working or pry it up, as Joe said. And if there was any traffic going by, they all stopped to see if they could help. And that, I think, is one of the characteristics that's gone and forgotten by nearly everyone.
I think another thing is, speaking of those flat tires, in those days you got out your patch and your and your jack, and you fixed it right there. And
pumped it back up.
You had a couple of, for tire irons, you had a couple of the leaves out of some old springs, to pry out those clincher tires. And when you got through, you could pump that thing up, and I'll tell you one thing, it was a tremendous exercise. And when you pump that up, because those are high pressure tires we had in those days. But it was quite an experience, and when you think that our community has grown and prospered from those days in the last 75 years, it's unbelievable.
Joe, I think one thing that comes to my mind about those old days, the narrow roads and the brick roads and one thing and another, we really think that a toll road is something that's real modern. But between our area and Jacksonville, when I first used to go up with my dad, there were 2 toll gates. And actually what they were, you were going across private property, and they'd have their son or their daughter or somebody out there by that gate if the minute they heard a car show up, and you paid at least a quarter to go through the gate. And of course, quarter was a little more in those days than it is now, but toll gates and toll highways aren't completely new.
speaking of that, when you wanted to go to St. Cloud from Melbourne, you put it on the flat car, and you had to pay for the hauling your car to Deer Park, and then you could unload it over at Deer Park at the ramp. And if you couldn't afford to have it hauled all the way over there, you just kept driving up.
What would it cost you to haul it over there?
I think it was about $2, something like that. And it was very important that because you'd save miles and miles when you wanted to go over to the Kissimmee and St. Cloud and into Orlando in those days, and to those cattlemen, that section over there in Kissimmee and St. Cloud in those days was a tremendous area because everybody was in the cattle business in this section.
Well, back in the early days that you're talking about, Dave, assuming you were going from Miami to Jacksonville, what kind of facilities would you have for spending the night, and restaurants and
Well, there used to be
service stations?
restaurants along the way, boarding house type restaurants, and then there were boarding houses. I never remember when it took more than a day to go to Jacksonville or Miami. And I remember very, very well the first time that we made it to Miami and back in the same day. That was a real experience for my father because it just was something real new.
I think that this is an interesting picture. That's a picture of the hotel here in Old O'Galley before there was ever oleanders or any of the others. And that's the way you used to come down here and you could stay overnight in this. Of course, they had wonderful sulfur water baths in there and all that smelled up the neighborhood. But they were great, and this is the kind of facilities you had basically until after Henry Flagler got through making his very fine hotels all up and down the coast.
I don't see any air conditioning sticking out of those windows, Joe.
Did you notice how big the windows are in there? And they always left you with a fan so you could fan yourself at night. See?
Okay. Dave, back in, say when you ran for county commission the first time, explain some of the things that were of interest to the people back then.
Well, you mean the election part of it, or?
Well, that, or our citrus, or our rivers.
Well, actually, what I think brought about my getting into politics, and as I think maybe we've already mentioned, I got in as a write-in candidate. The fact that my predecessor had, both on the port and the county commission, because in those days, the county commissioner from District Number 2 was automatically on the Port Authority, which I helped get separated because I felt like you couldn't very well work for two bosses. But back in those days when they cut the barge canal across Merritt Island, they cut the only road going the length of Merritt Island in two, and people that had orange groves on the north side of that canal wondered how they were going to get their fruit to market by the time it got ripe. And the effort was to put a barge in there and make a little ramp on each end of it, and drive down on the barge and across, and up the other side up another ramp, with the idea that the barge could be taken loose and turned sideways in case a boat wanted to go through the barge canal. It was strictly a business canal right from the beginning. It was to let boat traffic and barges and so forth go through. But the fact that they'd overlooked making a alternate route of getting back and forth with the fruit from North Merritt Island into Cocoa to pack it. So some of the people got real exercise and they started my write-in campaign, and we eventually did get another bridge, but in the meantime the people on the north part of Merritt Island lived for about a year with that floating barge, and I used to get phone calls in the middle of the night. Somebody had lost a bumper going up the ramp. I don't mean a bumper, I mean a muffler. And school buses had to go maneuver this quite interesting and dangerous ramp deal. But they've made the children get off the bus most of the time and walk across and then get back on the bus after the bus made that trip. The interesting part of all of that was that Brevard County, this was not real far back, this was in 1950, And Brevard County had 21,000 people in the whole county in those days. Then Cocoa Beach, for instance, I'll always remember, I bragged for years that I got all the votes but 9 in Cocoa Beach. And it's still a good brag if I don't tell you how many registered voters there were over there. There were only about 110 or something like that, and registered voters in the whole community of Cocoa Beach.
What year was that?
1950.
In those days, he had one of the most terrible bridges in the world. Instead of going across where you are now, you know, you had to go across and run down through Angel City and then cross on a little wooden bridge over there, and that brought him out just about where the surf is over there at the present time. And that was quite an experience to go over there in the middle of summer. I'll tell you, if you had a flat tire over there after dark, the mosquitoes would eat you lock, stock, and barrel.
But that bridge got done away with before 50, Joe.
Oh, a long time before.
Yeah, that
50.
was done along in 1941, if I remember right, when the government put Banana River Naval Air Base in where Patrick is now. They were very helpful in helping get new bridges across from the beach area to the mainland, both in the Cocoa area and the Melbourne area.
Well, back in those days, Dave, how would you get a doctor to your house, or where did the women go to have their babies that's if they were going to a hospital?
Well, of course, in those days, there was no hospital in Cocoa, or not in 50. In 50, you did have
Dr. Keniston started one up there about that.
Well, he started, in 1940. That's 41. And you had one in Melbourne.
We had one that was started by Dr. Hay way back in the 30s, which was the old Crenshaw Hotel. And from then on, we had, and the hospital we had on the highway down there, that many of you know where it is at the present time, is now full of office buildings, was a WPA building built by WPA labor from one end to the other, and it was in the early 30s, and that was the first hospital we had. But everybody had midwives, and the doctors would go and deliver them in the home and all that sort of thing. And I imagine most of the old-timers, they were born in their own house and with the assistance of a doctor or a midwife.
But what would you do, say, if you had to have an operation? Did Melbourne have a hospital?
They had the only real surgeon in the area at that time was Dr. Hay. We had a couple of the older fellows up in the Cocoa area that had done a tremendous job. Bobby Sternesauer's father was an outstanding doctor, if I remember correctly, and
he wasn't a surgeon.
No, he wasn't a surgeon. The only real surgeon, and we were able to obtain Dr. Hay from the St. Augustine Hospital up there at the railroad, the East Coast Hospital at St. Augustine. He came down here, he and his wife, and established this hospital, and he did all of the, after they established a hospital in Cocoa and Rockledge area and all, he was their main surgeon for all of these little areas. Did a tremendous job. And his lovely wife still lives down here, retired in the city of Melbourne.
Medicare paying most of the bills back then?
There was no such thing as Medicare. You marked it paid by the Lord, and those doctors did a tremendous job. And speaking of that, it was very interesting. I can remember many of those fellows like Dr. Creel and some of them telling how that the people would leave chickens on their porch, or groceries, or or vegetables they had raised or something like that in pay because they had no other way to pay them. And I think that's quite interesting. But that's what happened in our entire community with those doctors who came here in the beginning, because there was no money, but they did a tremendous job for the community.
Well, costs in medical care have gone up so tremendously in the last very few years. They've gone up. Of course, medical care has improved so tremendously that I guess justifies the increase in cost. But back in, my daughters were all born in Orlando, and the first one that was born was long in the early 40s. I had saved up money to pay the doctor and hospital bill, and I think it amounted to about $300 for the doctor, who was a really top-ranked OBGYN specialist, and the hospital altogether wasn't over $300. Nowadays, it costs about that much to get you registered, but it also, we have so much more to offer in a hospital than we did in those days.
Back, Joe, you became a county commissioner in what year? The first time?
52.
All right, and Dave, you went in about 50?
Yeah.
50, that's right.
Okay, so I've heard a lot of tales about mosquitoes, about the mosquito control started out originally with diking and dredges, and then it went to a truck with an airplane engine on the back with a prop to disseminate the smoke and airplanes, and that we were one of the first ones in the whole United States to try to control that problem. And you all have a very interesting story about how that got started and about where the dredge worked the first time, and who wants to lead off on that conversation?
Well, I think that both of us were involved in this. Luckily, we were the people that helped make it work in those early days, as David will tell you, and we just had to have a little more imagination than some of the others. And
were mosquitoes much of a problem back then?
Those days, a person could hardly stay outdoors after dark in the summertime, and especially on Merritt Island and the areas south of there.
Beach.
And Cocoa Beach and the areas on the beaches. And after we decided what we were going to do on permanent control, before that they had just sprayed, you know. And they thought that by spraying they could wipe out the mosquitoes, but after a while the DDT would make them immune, and it wouldn't even kill the mosquitoes. All it did was agitate them. And we decided that in the early days of what was necessary, and with permanent control, and that was impounding, and David came up with the concept of using the minnows, and it worked beautifully. And from that time on, we began to control the mosquitoes as you see that we're doing today. And remember, David, the first couple of years when we had was funding from the state that no one was interested. They thought we had lost our mind over here. Do you remember that?
That's real true. We lobbied and got the state legislature to pass a law or a bill appropriating $1 million for mosquito and fly control. They couldn't get the West Florida boys to go along with the voting for the mosquito control unless we tied into it fly control, and got that $1 million set up, and hardly anybody was drawing on it except Brevard, maybe St. Lucie County, but Brevard was doing very, very well getting.
First 2 or 3 years, no one but us.
That's right. And then all of a sudden, the West Florida boys found out that because they'd gotten that bill in there about being able to get help for flies, they were getting supplies and everything paid for out of that $1 million deal to spray all of their garbage dumps and that sort of thing with to keep down flies. So first thing you know, the $1 million was practically, we were going to not get very much money out of it. And Lee Winter came over to my place of business one day and said, Dave, this is the last day of the Florida legislature appropriations committee meetings in Tallahassee, and if we don't get some more money appropriated into the mosquito control bill, we're going to be lost for this coming 2 years. And I said, well, what'll it take, Lee, to accomplish that? He said, well, I think we've got enough. He said, between the two of us, I think we could tell them enough reasons to put in more money if we could get there. And he said, I've got a plane that's available right now. He said, if we could get in there, I think we could do some good. So I picked up the phone, and fortunately, Governor Collins's right-hand man had been a fraternity brother of mine at the University of Florida, and I called Bob Folks and asked him if there was some way he could help us get into the Appropriations Committee that afternoon at 2 o'clock, and he said, Dave, if you can get yourself up here by 2 o'clock, I'll take you by the hand and lead you in there. And I said, well, just start about half an hour before that looking for us in the hall, because we'll be there. And Lee cranked that airplane up, and we took off, got there. We we stayed in the Appropriations Committee the total of 15 minutes and got them to add another $1 million.
Lee was not a county commissioner at that time, though. Lee was head of mosquito control.
That's right. Lee was working for the county
That's right.
commissioners at that time and in full charge of the mosquito operation.
Well, did Brevard County have the worst mosquito control problem in Florida?
We thought so, didn't we?
We
Dave?
thought so, and I think we were way at the top of the list. St. Lucie County, Indian River County, all the way along the coast here had plenty of them, but we thought we were the worst, and I think that our Board of County Commissioners were the most determined to do something about it.
Do you remember?
Excuse me, go ahead.
I was going to say that we decided we had to have some dredging done, so unlike everybody else, we sat down and drew our own specifications. You remember, for the dredge, we called for the bids, and we bought the first dredges, and we picked the spot we felt could show us more of what we had to do, and that was right south of where Patrick Air Force Base is.
All right, now explain before you tell about that on why you needed the dredge, the diking and
For the diking
flooding.
and the flooding and this sort of thing, and so we decided on that spot, and when we got through that, we was going to move up into the Thousand Island area up there back in Merritt Island. But in that first dredging program we had over there, which is now where you hear about the Great Canal and everything else where Tortoise Island is, that we learned there that we were headed in the right direction. You remember, David? Because for the first time it made an impression even over on this side of the mainland, because we'd wiped out so many saltwater mosquitoes from that. And that told us we were headed in the right direction. From there, we began to acquire drag lines and another dredge, and we began to do all this impounding and spent years doing this, and it paid off many, many times.
I think somebody that's not familiar with the mosquito problem doesn't understand the diking. I mean, why did you do that?
We diked it so that we could control the water level in there, and this was the area in which we impounded with water, and then put all the mosquitoes, the minnows in there to eat up the mosquito larvae, and it did a tremendous job.
And how big would the average dike cover? Would it be a football field or a square
Oh, they
mile?
usually ended up with, sometimes you'd get up to 100 acres. You remember, David?
Yeah, from 20 acres up, we diked some.
And you would put minnows in there?
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
actually, we didn't have to put minnows in West, because in almost any diked-in area, there were some deep ponds, and they had some minnows in them.
But we used to stock them too, though. You
Well-
remember when we'd go to the state and get all the minnows?
Yeah.
And they were tremendous.
And then how would you flood it?
Well,
Wells.
we flooded it with two ways. We had some artesian wells that we had driven out there and flooded the impounded areas with that. We also had a big, or maybe more than one, pretty good sized portable pumps that we could move around and pump an impounded area and then move it to another impounded area, and pump from outside, pump from the ditches that were outside of the impounded area that had deep water in them.
And it's my understanding that we talked about the mosquito control problem in Florida, but that probably we were one of the first county governments in the United States to start a program like that.
Well, I think perhaps Florida as a whole has
Well,
led
we were
it.
the pioneers in this thing, and people used to come here from
Throughout the whole United States.
and to see how we were getting the job done. And I think one of the greatest assets we had was the fact that we were so poor in the beginning, we couldn't afford all these luxuries, and so we had to work out a solution that paid dividends. And from that time on, when instead of all of the people, well-to-do people from up north leaving here in May, like they used to, now they begin to stay part of the summer. And this is when things begin to turn around here in Brevard County as far as our economy and life as we see it today.
And I remember, I came here in '56, and the year I came here was just the starting of the expansion program with the construction of Kennedy Space Center. And I think we went from like 50,000 people in the county to 300,000 people in a 4 or 5 year period. But I also remember that you could not get an FHA mortgage on a home unless it was served by some county or city facilities such as running water, sewerage, and so the water system really opened up the development on Merritt Island as far as residential units were concerned. Now, I hear this, I don't know whether it's true, but why don't you all discuss the early homework that you two did on the county commission with our water system, which right now is a model, I think, throughout the state of Florida still. How you all got it done and some of the interesting developments in that.
Well, Cocoa was very, very bad in need of a water system. They had a very small one, pumped about 1 million gallons of water a day, and Clear Lake would go dry. And
The water came out of Clear Lake?
water came out of Clear Lake, which is the small lake right behind BCC College there in Cocoa. And they just had to do something. And about that same time, Patrick Air Force Base had come to the conclusion that they had to have water that wasn't as salty as the water. They were using water out of wells out there at Patrick, and it was about 2,400 parts per million. I heard a colonel once say that it was the only place he'd ever been that you had to put scotch in the water to be able to drink it. And I think that was pretty nearly true. But anyway, because of the Civilian Military Relations Council that Brevard County has had for so long, through that, we'd gotten to know quite a few of the military people on a first name basis. We knew how bad they were concerned about getting water, and we knew how bad Cocoa was. The city manager of Cocoa was Claude Dial, who had grown up about 100 yards from me on Merritt Island, and we thought an awful lot alike, so he asked me if I would help from a county standpoint on the water deal, and Joe and the rest of the guys all said go to it. So we started working with the military and trying to find some way that they could help finance a water system. And we found a million ways, it seemed like, why they couldn't. But we were having an awful time finding anything they could do that was legal for them to do. But we finally came up with one thing. They couldn't give us a long-term contract, and they couldn't loan us money. They couldn't do this, and they couldn't do that. But when they browsed through all of their rules and records, they found nothing that said they couldn't put up a connecting charge. So Patrick worked out a deal with Cocoa that they put up a $4 million connecting charge. Cocoa didn't have a whole lot of credit back in those days, but when they had $4 million in this hand, it wasn't too hard to go to the bond companies and say, we need $4 more million on bonds. And so Cocoa was able to raise $8 million, and for $8 million, they put in a well field in Orange County, a water plant in Cocoa, piping system from the well field all the way into Cocoa of 36-inch size, then across the Indian River and across the Banana River at a 24-inch size, all the way to Patrick and all the way to the Canaveral Air Force Station. Then they later added it all over Merritt Island. They went quite a little bit over Merritt Island at the very beginning, but they've since have gone all the way to Kennedy Space Center and things like that with their water system. All, like you say, the big motivating thing from the county standpoint and the city standpoint was that you could not get FHA or VA to build a house on a lot that had its own water system and its own sewer system on that same lot. You had to have one or the other. So when we got city water, it was still allowable to have a septic tank, as long as they weren't having to drink water out of the well from the same line. And Wes, it's hard to believe, but there were people living on 50-foot lots back before this situation got straightened up. There were people living on 50-foot lots with 2 and 3 house trailers parked in their backyard, all using the same septic tank, all using the same shallow well from right next to the septic tank. And that's the truth.
I think one of the most interesting things was that to get this agreement with them, that that the water district had to pledge so many million gallons a day, and that, you remember that? I thought that was interesting, and I think, David, you ought to tell the people why that the Air Force was able to help on this thing is because the water system, they pledged so many million gallons a day to them, and this was the reason that they were able to get that money borrowed and get this construction program, because they had a built-in customer.
But wasn't the main purpose for the water for cooling for the missiles when they went off, or the rocket?
Up at Kennedy Space Center,
Right.
yes, that
But
was.
that's the main reason the Air Force needed it, wasn't it?
Yeah, but that was before those days. I mean, what they were trying
That
to do
was
get
the
drinking
later
water
thing
in
that
those
came
days.
along.
So primarily it was drinking water they were
Right.
That is correct.
The primary thing was water to Patrick.
Right.
Going to Kennedy Space Center was another step a little later on. But as Joe said, I think they not only, Cocoa had to pledge a certain amount of water, they also, of course, had to pay back this $4 million connecting charge. They paid it back with a reduced water rate, which made it very livable for Cocoa and very beneficial for
That's what I was
Patrick.
trying to get
It was one of those things that had to work because it helped everybody.
That's correct.
Well, what would have happened to our development in Brevard County had we not had that system?
We wouldn't have had any in Central County, I don't think, because we had no way of overcoming that fact. We would have just never had FHA.
I've seen Clear Lake, and it doesn't look that big to give the existing population back at that time enough water. So it was very marginal then.
It
wasn't
was very marginal. As I say, they pumped about 1 million gallons a day, but lots of days, by the time they'd done that, the lake was almost dry.
And
Well, I
not only-
remember-
yeah, I was going to say, one of the interesting things is that all we could find in those early days is some shallow aquifers around that did not have the reserve and potential for expansion and growth. And with the concept that they had for the Cocoa water system is the thing that laid the groundwork for all the future development of Brevard County, as you know today. And now we're in the same process of trying to reach out and find a total new source for the fast-growing area here in South Brevard, and we're going to find it. In fact, we've got it found.
Well, I think you've got it found. In fact, I think really, I don't mean to be critical of anybody who made the decision, but I think Melbourne made a bad decision to go into Lake Washington in the first place. I think they maybe should have joined with Cocoa and come right across on that same pipeline and spread out from there.
Back in those days, they could have done it very easily.
Could have done it, but that's second guessing, and Monday morning quarterbacking is real easy. But the thing that I wanted to say, I got telling you about all those trailers in the backyards. I think this is another thing that made us realize we had to do something about zoning, and that's another big step that's so much bigger to the way when it got accomplished than anybody that tells about it or goes back and says, oh, you put in zoning. Well, sure we did, but we sweat blood and tears doing it. And I sat one day in running a meeting. Joe was sitting there for a public hearing on whether or not we should have zoning, and I had women. I started to say ladies, but I won't give them credit for that because they actually came up to the other side of the table and spat at me.
You know, people, what they didn't understand is that we had to put some controls in for the future development of this county, and we were the people that had to make that decision. And I will say this, that the county commission in those days was very strong, and they had to make the necessary decisions because we not only had plat laws, we had zoning, we had subdivision laws, we had building codes. We did all of this in our early days, and it was most critical from a lot of the people in the area. But this is the reason we've been able to develop as we have, because we were strong in those days.
Well, I moved here in September of '56, and we moved in the house, and it was up in Cocoa Hills, one of Mr. Annis's homes. It was right close to the railroad track. And that's when the expansion was just starting. And I went up to him in about June and looked at the house. And when I was looking at it, the train went by. And I said, Mr. Annis, isn't this house awful close to the railroad tracks? And he said, there's no damn way he'd live in it, but that was about the only place I had because there wasn't any places in Cocoa to live. So anyhow, I bought it, and there were 13 houses there, and there was no Pine Ridge. And they had run a 1/4-inch water pipe up there to mix cement with and stuff. Well, these 13 homes are now occupied. They still got a 1/4-inch pipe. You could not flush the toilet or take a shower after about 5:30 in the morning. You had to get on odd hours to use it. But the reason I brought it up when you're talking about water is my in-laws and my parents lived in West Palm Beach. And when my mother-in-law would come up, she'd bring one of the little 5-gallon water jugs. And when the water was gone, she went home. So if we got mad at her, we'd dump the water out, and she'd go on back to West Palm Beach. So, but I do think one of the main things that developed Central Brevard and our Space Center is the water system and the way you all finagled and got the thing done. And I didn't know whether, even to bring it up, Dave, but one of the funny stories you told me is how that little plot of ground out at Patrick where they hit these little white balls got started, but you got over that pretty good and didn't mention it. But, it's sort of scratching somebody's back and they scratch yours. Or
Well, I think it'd probably be safe to say now it's been so long that anybody that was in the service is long since out of the service and gone. But there was sort of an understood arrangement that if we started the dredging on the south end of Patrick, that we not only were getting the biggest spot of mosquito breeding in the county, what we would end up leaving would be some kind of uneven land and with kind of little creeks and water areas in it. And if they could find a use for it, they probably would. And anyway, they encouraged us to do this to such an extent that the Air Force furnished Brevard County a lot of extra spray that year.
Right.
In fact, for the next couple of years, Brevard County was having a very difficult time buying benzene hexachloride. It was a limited product, and we didn't rate very high on governmental priority lists. But Patrick, of course, did, and they were able to get some when we couldn't, and they asked us to use it in spraying, and if we sprayed their base first, if we had a little left over every morning, it'd be all right to spray it around the edges. Well, Mims and Sebastian turned out to be edges, but we did, I think, get rid of a lot of mosquitoes that way. And it turned out that that land wasn't totally wasted. That's where Patrick Air Force Base Golf Club is now, and it made a very nice place for a golf course.
I think one of the interesting things about that whole thing, and we furnished them with marl and everything else because the cost of those that mosquito dope, as we used to call it in those days, was real expensive. And I think the most interesting thing is that when NASA came into the Cape Canaveral area and decided that they were going to develop the whole area, they were going to take over their own mosquito control, and the Air Force insisted that the county be in charge of the mosquito control up there because they had done such an outstanding job. And today the county still is in charge of mosquito control up there in all those impounded areas, and they work closely with NASA. And it's one of the greatest things that ever happened because we had learned over many, many years of hard work the things it was going to take to make that area function and how to control the mosquitoes, and it's paid off many, many times in the past.
Well, there's two things I have is clear in my mind on what you all have said. One of them, that back in those early days, is that you weren't city slickers and knew everything. You went to the government and you helped each other in a spirit of cooperation. And you mentioned the civilian military group, which is still going on now today, but I think anytime you can work with somebody and not try to find out why it won't work, but to be friends and go forward with it, which I think we've always had enough country boys in Brevard County that get along with everybody that we've done pretty well.
Wes, that's certainly always been my philosophy, and I know it has Joe's. When I first went on the Board of County Commission, it was the first year or two that Brevard County had gone county-wide on the election. Brevard County had operated, as we are about to undertake a new cycle of, running as a independent. Each district was independent. If you were running for county commissioner on Merritt Island, you only had to run on Merritt Island in district number 2. You didn't have to have your name on the ballot in Melbourne or Rogue Galley. But that had just ended because somebody had proven in the Florida Supreme Court that it was done illegally. And so when I went on the board, we were operating as a countywide organization. When I went on the board, district number 2 had their own equipment. It was one awful big junk pile, and it wouldn't have done for an attic sale. I sold most of it off to the junk man and started over buying one truck at a time. I remember really resenting having to put a $10,000 stoplight out on the intersection of A1A and 520, because that stoplight would have bought 2 dump trucks back in those days. And I saw the need where I could do more good for more people in more parts of the district with a couple of dump trucks. But also we had to put up the stoplight, or that light would have wiped out half the population. I think people were having accidents there like you wouldn't believe.
You know, when I look back and I think of the things that happened to us in those days, that our community, as an example, when I started in this district number 5, which is this area in which we are in at the present time, not that it's changed, we asked at that time the legislature whether we could have single-member districts, and they told us that it was illegal to have single-member districts because you were making the rules and regulations and in charge of the entire county. Therefore, you had to answer to all the people. But now times have changed, and today, all of a sudden, it's single-member districts again, and I think that they have many disadvantages because when you try to get things done on a countywide basis, you have a very difficult time sometimes getting everybody to agree enough to get the project done, whatever it may be. And I think that before it's over with, we're going to have some very interesting discussions over that.
Well, I like the idea of a county commissioner being a county commissioner instead of a district commissioner.
I do too.
I do too. I think it's the only way it can really operate. I think we'll go back to it in due course of time. Okay. People who have never experienced this single-member district will have to go through it and see how it doesn't work. But I started to say, back with the equipment deal, Sweet Smith had some pretty decent equipment at District 4 in the Cocoa District, and Max Rhodes in his district for the South End had some nice equipment. So those were my 2 closest allies on the commission when I first went on, and things used to be choose up sides quite a bit back as a result of having been single-member districts for so many years. But anyway, I made friends with, to the point with Max and Sweet, that they would feel sorry for me and loan me some of their equipment, and we did get a few roads graded once in a while and some things like that with borrowed equipment. Now, under the system that Brevard County has operated under up until this year, everything went into one pool, and it was county equipment. It wasn't district equipment. I think you're going to see it go back to being district equipment, and then if my district has a machine, I don't necessarily have to let the other district use it at all. That's some more stuff that I think everybody's got to find it out.
But Joe, we've talked a lot about Central Brevard with Patrick and our water system, and do you have anything on the tail end of this program today that you'd like to talk about in South Brevard that was important?
Well, I think that one of the things that we learned in the beginning when they established the Civilian Military Council was that here in the south end of the county, we were beginning to have trouble with the military and the policing of the area. And we suddenly realized that we were all getting into trouble because the little municipalities were taking the bull by the horns and making it very difficult for the military. So we met with the leadership of Patrick in those early days and decided that there had to be some way that we could get together and make things work. And doing that is when we began to form the Civilian Military Council as you see it today. It was done by the county commissioners. We agreed that the military would take care of their problems and their personnel when they came to town, and that we would tend to our own business. And I'll say this, the military was a great more severe with their personnel than we would have been. And from that day on, we've had a perfect harmony program in the entire county, and it's been wonderful because we probably have the finest relationship in the entire United States between the civilians and the military, because there's no line drawn. They're all part of a family today. And when we began to establish the mosquito control program as we see it today and all, this was the time that South Brevard began to flourish and grow, because we had opened up the area, put in drainage where it needs to be, so that all these various areas you see today that were underwater are now beautiful places for development. And then we began to grow and prosper, and from that day on up until now, we have really been able to do many things, and the future is very bright for us.
I don't think there's any, and I'm sure everybody loves the area they're from, but I've yet to see a place I'd rather live than Brevard County, and I'm sorry I was born in Palm Beach County. I wish I'd have been from Brevard, but you'll never get me back where I came from.
I'm the same way. They'll never get me off of this good old Indian River, I'll tell you that.
Well, that about concludes our program for today, and we'll be back same time, same day next week. Thank you very much.